The cold metal floor vibrated beneath Captain Daniel Briggs as he regained consciousness. The last thing he remembered was the ambush, an unseen force slamming into his team's position like a tidal wave. His rifle wrenched from his grasp before a white-hot pain erupted behind his eyes. Now his wrists were bound, the cuffs biting into his skin, and the taste of iron filled his mouth. He forced his breathing to steady, taking in his surroundings without moving. The chamber was dimly lit, its walls smooth and sterile, too perfect to be human construction. A faint hum resonated through the floor, the sound of massive engines pulsing in the distance. He was aboard a ship. The realization tightened his gut. Not just captured, taken off-world. He shifted slightly, enough to feel the presence of his men around him. Sergeant First Class Jackson Cole sat to his right, his broad frame tense, but breathing steady. To his left, Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos murmured something under his breath. Spanish, a quiet prayer. Further along, Master Sergeant Will Grady and Chief Warrant Officer Paul Mercer completed the circle. A door hissed open. Footsteps. The air carried a strange, metallic tang, something artificial and sterile. Then came the voice, smooth and laced with disdain. You are awake. Briggs didn't react immediately, instead letting his captor speak first. The figure stepped into the low light, tall, draped in dark armor that pulsed with faint energy lines. Alien. Humanoid but wrong. The proportions were slightly off, the angles too sharp. The Empire soldiers, then. You struggle against inevitability. The alien continued, its voice precise, each word carrying the weight of superiority. Your kind is primitive, undisciplined, yet you manage to be disruptive. Briggs lifted his head slightly, meeting the creature's gaze. He didn't need to see its face to know its type. Conquerors always spoke the same way, whether they came from Earth or the farthest reaches of space. You don't know what you've caught, he said, voice rough but steady. The alien paused, perhaps amused. You are prisoners of the Zarkan Empire. Your purpose now is to provide intelligence. You will be studied, broken if necessary. Briggs heard Cole exhale slowly, controlled, measured. It was the only warning before the sergeant shifted, testing the cuffs. The alien noticed. A flick of its wrist sent a pulse through the restraints, a sharp jolt that stiffened Cole's muscles. He grunted, but nothing more. We will see how long your defiance lasts, the alien mused before turning away. The door sealed behind it. Briggs flexed his fingers, feeling the subtle give in the cuffs. Not solid metal, some kind of alloy, flexible under strain. A weak point. Mercer shifted. Captain. A whisper, barely audible. Briggs tilted his head slightly. Check in. Still breathing, Grady muttered. Mad as hell, Cole added. Same, Santos breathed. Mercer let out a quiet chuckle. Guess we're still in the fight. Briggs focused on the bindings. He had no illusions about what was coming. This wasn't some third-world dictatorship, running an amateur operation. The Empire would dissect them, strip away their tactics, analyze their every move. If they waited, they'd die just slower. How long was I out? Briggs asked. Few hours, Mercer replied. They got us all. No sign of our gear. Just these fancy cuffs. Any patrols? 2-man shifts, rotating every 10 minutes. That one was the first to talk. Briggs processed the information. They were underestimated, held in what was likely a temporary holding area rather than maximum security. A mistake. He rolled his wrists again, applying pressure in calculated increments. The cuffs resisted, then shifted slightly. Not indestructible, just precise. Grady noticed. You got something. Maybe. Briggs exhaled, shifting his focus. Santos, you still got that piece? A pause. Then a soft scrape of metal on metal as Santos maneuvered, his fingers brushing against his boot. A sliver of steel, barely an inch long, tucked into the seam of his uniform. It wasn't a weapon. It was a tool. Got it. Pass it down, Briggs murmured. The movement was slow, deliberate, hidden beneath the natural shifts of their bodies. The scrap of metal made its way to Briggs, and he pressed it against the seam of his cuffs, feeling for the internal locking mechanism. Not standard handcuffs, more advanced, pressure-sensitive. He adjusted his grip, applying tension in precise bursts. The lock gave a subtle click. He stilled. No alarms. No reaction. He shifted his hands apart, feeling the restraint loosen just enough. Not enough to break free, but enough to know it could be done. He passed the tool back. It works. Grady exhaled. Hell of a thing. Briggs turned his attention to the door. They had time, minutes, not hours. Their captors thought they were contained. That was their second mistake. Next shift change, Briggs murmured. We move. The plan unfolded in sharp, quiet exchanges. They had no weapons, no armor, nothing but their training and the arrogance of their captors. Briggs flexed his hands again, waiting. The ship hummed beneath them, oblivious to what was about to happen. Outside, the next set of footsteps approached. The door slid open, and Briggs counted 2 sets of footsteps. The guards moved with the lazy confidence of men who believed in their own superiority. That was all the advantage his team needed. The moment the first stepped close enough, Cole surged forward, snapping the weakened cuffs and driving his knee into the alien's midsection. The creature barely had time to react before Mercer twisted behind the second guard, wrenching its arm back with brutal precision. The dull crack of bone was swallowed by the ship's hum. Briggs was already moving, his fingers tightening around the first alien's sidearm before it could even process the shift in control. One pull of the trigger, and a bolt of searing energy lanced through the air, silencing any hope of an alarm. Grady caught the second guard before it could collapse, lowering its body to the floor. The team moved in sync, stripping weapons and checking the corridor. Santos knelt, using the sliver of metal once more, freeing the last of the team's restraints. The air smelled of scorched ozone and blood, the tension humming between them. They were loose, but they weren't out. Briggs gestured, and the team fell in line. The corridor stretched in both directions, dimly illuminated by the faint glow of the ship's control systems. The Empire's ships were designed for efficiency, sterile, modular, cold. That meant patterns, and patterns meant exploitable weaknesses. Navigation's gotta be central, Mercer murmured. Briggs nodded. Weapons first. They moved quickly, low and controlled. Every step was deliberate. The Empire's arrogance was their advantage. Security was minimal, designed to contain rather than to prevent escape. That would change the moment they were discovered. A turn in the corridor brought them to a larger chamber, storage, judging by the crates stacked along the walls. Briggs held up a fist, signaling a halt. Cole and Grady moved in first, sweeping for hostiles. Clear. The team spread out, prying open the nearest containers. Inside, their weapons gleamed under the artificial light. Rifles, sidearms, knives. More than they had been taken with. Either the Empire had collected spoils from other engagements, or this ship was moving equipment to the front lines. Either way, it worked to their advantage. Briggs slung his rifle over his shoulder, feeling the familiar weight settle into place. His team did the same, their movements methodical, precise. There was no relief, only readiness. This wasn't over. Santos cracked a grin. Christmas came early. Let's make good use of it, Briggs muttered. They moved out, weapons primed. Every second counted. The Empire would notice the silence soon. The corridors led them deeper into the ship, toward the armory's secondary systems. A central security hub loomed ahead, its doors sealed. The interface glowed with alien script, shifting in unreadable patterns. Mercer, Briggs ordered. The warrant officer stepped forward, eyes scanning the controls. It's biometric. Needs an officer's clearance. Briggs looked down at the dead guard's body. then at the pooling blood around its ruined torso. Clearance wouldn't be an option. Grady was already moving, prying open a side panel, exposing the control system's internals. Wires pulsed with a soft blue glow. Data streams shifting beneath their surfaces. "Give me a second," Grady muttered. "I can short it." Briggs turned, scanning the corridor behind him. Time was running thin. He could feel it pressing down, the weight of impending discovery. Grady worked fast, fingers dancing over the alien circuitry. A spark flared, and the console flickered. The door hissed open. "Go," Briggs ordered. They moved inside, securing the chamber. Screens lined the walls, displaying ship schematics, security feeds, and fleet formations. Briggs absorbed the information in seconds. They weren't just on any ship. They were aboard a command vessel. Santos whistled under his breath. "Damn, this thing's running coordination for a whole detachment." Briggs exhaled slowly. "Then we take it apart from the inside." Mercer slid into a terminal, fingers working over the interface. "This encryption's a nightmare, but I can get into their navigation. Maybe weapons." "Start with their comms," Briggs said. "Cut them off." Mercer nodded, working fast. The screen shifted, alien symbols collapsing as the system was overridden. Grady moved to another terminal, scanning the ship's internal layout. "Engines are deep, heavily shielded. We won't be able to sabotage them without setting off alarms." Briggs weighed their options. They couldn't just escape. If they did, the Empire would learn from this. Adapt. That wasn't acceptable. They needed to send a message. Cole was already one step ahead. "We overload the power core." Santos grinned. "Now you're talking." Mercer tapped the screen. "Give me a minute. I can set a cascade failure in their reactor. It won't go off immediately, but when it does, it'll be loud." Briggs finished. The ship rumbled beneath them. Briggs felt it in his bones, an atmospheric shift. "They know," Grady muttered. A klaxon blared, red warning lights flashing. The screen Mercer was working on locked up, alien script flashing in defiant warning. "Lockdown's hitting," Mercer growled. "I need more time." "Then take it," Briggs ordered. "We hold here." The team moved, positioning themselves for the inevitable assault. The Empire's forces would come hard, but they were predictable. Tactical doctrine dictated containment first, then overwhelming force. That gave them an opening. Briggs leveled his rifle as the first wave arrived. The door barely had time to slide open before his shot burned through the first alien's skull. Cole and Grady fired in tandem, cutting down the second. Santos swept left, his rifle barking in controlled bursts. The corridor filled with smoke and bodies. "Still working," Mercer called. Briggs dropped another soldier, then another. The Empire was fast, but they lacked adaptability. They relied on numbers. That wouldn't save them here. A tremor rippled through the ship. Lights flickered. Mercer slammed a fist against the console. "Done." Briggs moved. "Fall back." They peeled away, shifting toward the nearest evacuation route. The reactor would take time to go critical, but when it did, it would rip this ship apart from the inside. The Empire had taken them alive. That had been their first mistake. Underestimating them had been their last. The ship trembled beneath their boots as Briggs led his team through the winding corridors. The distant groan of straining metal a warning of what was coming. The reactor overload was already in motion, a slow and inevitable death sentence for the Imperial warship. They had minutes, maybe less, to get off before the entire vessel was torn apart. Cole took point, weapon raised, eyes scanning the junction ahead. The emergency klaxons blared, a constant wail of alien urgency. But the Empire's response was still uncoordinated. The suddenness of their escape, the sheer audacity of their attack, had thrown the crew into chaos. That gave them an opening. Santos pulled up alongside Briggs, breathing hard. "Hangars 2 decks down. If we move now, we can beat whatever reinforcements they're scrambling." Briggs nodded. "Then we move now." The team fell into step, moving with purpose. The corridors blurred together in their sterile, alien efficiency. each hallway identical to the last. But Briggs wasn't relying on sight alone. He trusted the map they had pulled from the control room. The layout burned into his memory. They had one shot. A flicker of motion at the next junction sent them all into cover. Shadows stretched across the walls, elongated by the flickering emergency lights. Mercer shifted his grip on his rifle, finger poised over the trigger. "They're setting up ahead," Grady murmured. Briggs exhaled slowly. The Empire had finally found its footing. The aliens might have been slow to react, but they were disciplined. They wouldn't send a trickle of forces now. They would build a wall and force the intruders to break against it. He glanced at Mercer. Options. The warrant officer took a quick look at the overhead displays. Emergency bulkheads are in place near the maintenance shafts. If we cut through there, we can bypass them. Cole frowned. And if they're locked down? Briggs answered for him. Then we blow through. Santos grinned. My favorite kind of problem solving. They pulled back, doubling through an adjoining corridor, the distant sounds of alien soldiers reinforcing their previous position. The Empire was expecting them to take the direct route. That was their second mistake. The maintenance shaft was sealed with a thick panel of reinforced alloy, an automated lock glowing a faint blue. Mercer didn't hesitate, already jamming a blade into the panel's interface, prying open its inner circuitry. Sparks flared as he worked, rerouting power, forcing the controls into a reset. Faster, Grady muttered. Briggs kept his weapon up, sweeping the corridor behind them. The moment the Empire realized they weren't walking into their trap, they would adjust. He could feel the shift coming, the unseen gears of Imperial doctrine grinding against their tactics. Mercer exhaled sharply. Got it. The lock disengaged with a hiss, the panel sliding open to reveal the maintenance crawlway beyond. The team slipped inside, weapons close, the confined space forcing them into a single-file line. It was tight, claustrophobic, but it was an opening. They moved quickly, following the passage as it angled downward. The ship rumbled again, the distant groan of structural strain growing louder. The overload was progressing faster than expected. Not much time, Cole muttered. Briggs already knew. They weren't just racing against the Empire now. They were racing against the ship's own death. The maintenance shaft ended at another sealed hatch, this one leading directly into the upper tier of the hangar bay. The moment Mercer pulled it open, the world beyond exploded into chaos. The hangar was a battlefield. Alien soldiers moved in coordinated squads, setting up firing lines, blocking access to the few remaining ships docked along the flight deck. Fighters and shuttles were in the process of being locked down, emergency procedures overriding standard launch controls. The Empire wasn't taking chances. Briggs took it all in within seconds, scanning for openings, exits, anything they could exploit. There, Santos pointed. A transport, larger than the surrounding fighters, its ramp still partially lowered. It wasn't prepped for launch yet, but it was their best bet. We fight our way through, Briggs decided. There was no need for further discussion. The team fanned out, rifles raising as they stepped onto the platform above the hangar, the element of surprise still in their favor. The first burst of gunfire cut through the nearest Imperial squad, alien bodies dropping as the rest scrambled for cover. The response was immediate. The Empire wasn't caught off guard this time. They had numbers, fortifications, firepower. The Green Berets had skill, adaptability, and sheer American defiance. Cole and Grady moved first, laying suppressive fire, while Mercer and Santos flanked left, angling toward the transport. Briggs covered them, each shot precise, efficient. Every movement was calculated. They weren't fighting to win this battle. They were fighting to end it before it could drag out. Alien energy bolts scorched the air around them, impacting against metal support beams, melting into jagged scars along the walls. The Empire soldiers weren't hesitating anymore. They had learned. It didn't matter. The Green Berets weren't here to trade shots. They were here to finish what they started. Santos reached the transport first, slamming into the side of the hull, using its bulk as cover. Mercer followed, already working the control panel to override the lockdown sequence. Briggs held his position, scanning the hangar for the next wave. The Empire wasn't going to let them go without a final push. He was right. The far hangar doors rumbled open, revealing a new squadron of Imperial reinforcements, heavier armor, heavier weapons. These weren't just soldiers. These were enforcers, the Empire's equivalent of shock troopers. "Mercer," Briggs called. "Almost there," came the tight response. Briggs gritted his teeth, shifting his aim. The shock troopers advanced with methodical precision, their weapons burning hot, their armor reinforced against standard rifle fire. Grady cursed. "These guys don't go down easy." Briggs didn't care. "Then we make them." They adjusted fire, aiming for gaps, for weak points. Shots connected, but the shock troopers pressed forward, undeterred. The Empire had finally sent something worth killing. The ship roared beneath them. Another tremor, more violent than before, the structure buckling. The reactor wasn't just overloading now. It was breaking the ship apart piece by piece. "Done," Mercer shouted. The transport powered to life, its engines flaring as the lockdown disengaged. The ramp fully extended, giving them the opening they needed. Briggs moved first, covering as the team scrambled aboard. Santos took the cockpit, hands flying over controls, bypassing alien security. "Straps," Santos barked. Briggs barely had time to grab hold before the ship lurched, the hangar bay spinning as the transport blasted off the deck. Shock troopers fired, energy bolts flashing past as the escape vessel rocketed forward. The artificial gravity warped around them before stabilizing, the viewport filling with the vast expanse of open space. And then, with a final, brilliant detonation, the warship was gone. Briggs exhaled, his grip tightening on his rifle. They weren't just free. They had left a scar, a message. The Empire had taken them alive. That had been their first mistake. Underestimating them had been their last. The transport streaked through the void, its engines burning hot as Santos pushed the throttle to its limit. The ship rattled under the strain, untested by human hands, but now forced into an escape it was never meant to make. Behind them, the wreckage of the Imperial warship drifted in ruin, torn apart by its own systems, a graveyard of twisted metal and burning wreckage. They had left their mark, but the fight wasn't over. Briggs braced himself against the bulkhead, scanning the navigation screen over Santos' shoulder. The Empire would not let them vanish into the dark. The moment that ship had gone up, the moment the alarms had blared across the fleet, the hunt had begun, and the Empire's warships were fast. They had taken a vessel not built for war, an unarmed transport with no shields capable of withstanding the pursuit that was already coming for them. Cole sat against the hull, reloading with the methodical precision of a man who knew the job wasn't finished. Grady adjusted his harness, checking over Mercer's work at the console, making sure nothing had been left to chance. Santos kept his focus on the stars ahead, angling their course toward the nearest cover. They had minutes before the Empire's net closed around them. Briggs activated the ship's long-range sensors. The Empire had no intention of losing them. They weren't just rogue prisoners anymore. They were symbols of defiance. The Empire didn't tolerate symbols. "They're hurting us. They know we'll have to run blind," Mercer added. Briggs nodded. "So we don't." That wasn't how this ended. Not after everything they had done. Briggs gestured to the controls. "We take the fight to them." Santos grinned. "Now you're talking." Mercer had already pulled up the internal schematics of the ship. It was a cargo transport, meant for moving personnel and supplies, not for battle. But the Empire built redundancy into everything. If they had power to burn, they could push the engines beyond safe limits. If they had access to the ship's maintenance core, they could reroute systems, overclock the reactor, force more output than the ship's designers had ever anticipated. Cole rolled his shoulders. "And when they board?" Briggs smirked. "We welcome them." The team moved without hesitation. Santos locked in a trajectory, shifting their course erratically, making it impossible for the Empire to anticipate their next move. Mercer and Grady worked the ship systems, forcing raw energy into the thrusters, overriding limiters, feeding excess power into artificial gravity fields to counter the strain. The ship groaned in protest, but it held. Briggs took position, rifle in hand. They had made it this far. They weren't about to be cornered like animals now. The first Imperial ship closed the distance, a sleek hunter-killer built for pursuit. It moved with predatory grace, shifting ahead of them, cutting off their approach to the asteroid belt that could have masked their escape. Warning sirens blared through the stolen transport as the Empire hailed them, a cold, sterile voice ordering their surrender. Santos cut the comms. Not today. Briggs gave him the signal. Santos slammed the throttle forward, sending the transport into a full-speed burn directly toward the Imperial vessel. The move was reckless. The Empire had expected hesitation, fear, a desperate scramble to flee. What they got instead was a ship charging straight into their formation, engines screaming, energy signatures spiking to dangerous levels. The Imperial vessel hesitated, its pilots uncertain. That hesitation was all the Green Berets needed. At the last possible second, Santos killed the engines, flipping the transport into a violent maneuver that sent them rolling beneath the enemy ship's firing arc. The stolen vessel scraped past, just outside the Imperial ship's engagement zone. Before the Empire could react, Grady triggered the power reroute, forcing a burst of energy into the external thrusters. The pulse detonated outward, slamming into the enemy ship's hull, sending it spiraling off course. "Beautiful," Mercer muttered. Briggs didn't celebrate. "They're still coming." The Empire's remaining ships adjusted, no longer playing the waiting game. The pursuit force moved in for the kill, sending volleys of energy fire cutting through the black. The Green Berets ducked as impacts rattled through the ship, heat warnings blaring, hull plating melting under the assault. The Empire wasn't playing games anymore. Cole gritted his teeth. That asteroid belt still an option? Santos checked the readout. "If we make it in one piece." Briggs made the call. "Then we make it." The ship lurched as another blast clipped the side, throwing sparks through the cabin. Mercer struggled to keep the systems from cascading into full failure. The Empire wasn't letting them go. Briggs pulled himself to the nearest console, scanning the tactical display. The asteroid belt was close, but they needed an edge, something to tilt the odds in their favor. Then he saw it, a derelict station, half buried in the drifting rock, long abandoned but still drawing faint energy from an automated core. It was a remnant of a forgotten war, a structure the Empire had ignored, nothing but scrap in the void. But to the Green Berets, it was opportunity. Briggs pointed. "There." Santos adjusted course, wrenching the transport toward the station. The Empire followed, moving in for the kill, closing the gap. The ship's engines whined in protest, but the modifications held, driving them toward the skeletal remains of the station. The Empire anticipated another desperate escape attempt. What they didn't anticipate was the trap. Mercer grinned. "This is going to be good." As they neared the station, Grady triggered the final override. The ship dumped its remaining energy into a final burst of propulsion, sending them rocketing toward the station before suddenly cutting all active emissions. The Empire ships, still locked in pursuit, followed. They didn't question the sudden shift in energy. They thought they had forced the Green Berets into a last-ditch maneuver. They didn't realize they had been led into a killing ground. The transport skimmed the station's surface, using its dead exterior as cover. The Empire's ships weren't as lucky. Their pursuit was too direct, their velocity too high. By the time they realized the trap, it was too late. The first vessel clipped the outer ring of the station, its hull shearing against ancient debris, breaking apart in a cascade of twisted metal. The second tried to pull up, only to be caught in the gravitational drag of a passing asteroid, sending it tumbling into the wreckage. The third never had a chance. The station's automated defenses, long dormant, suddenly flickered to life, triggered by the unexpected energy spikes. The Empire's ships, caught in the activation radius, became immediate targets. The old guns fired, remnants of a war long past, but still functional enough to do damage. The last ship was torn apart by its own arrogance. Briggs exhaled. The Green Berets were still standing. The Empire wasn't. Santos adjusted their course, taking them deeper into the asteroid field, beyond the Empire's reach. They had done the impossible. They had been captured, caged, hunted, and they had broken free, leaving ruin in their wake. Briggs looked at his team, each man battered but unbroken. The Empire had underestimated them. That mistake had cost them dearly, and it would not be the last time.